Hello viewers. So I have been discussing the various verticals of the Russia-Ukraine war, and one among them, in fact one of the most important among them, is the economic impact of the war. While the entire world is suffering in innumerable ways, but the detrimental impact on Europe's industries across the board has been really unnerving. Every day, some news emerges of some industrial giant closing down because they cannot sustain business because of rising prices of energy and for lack of demand. Now, the reasons behind the current turmoil in Europe's industries are not really straightforward. So, a singular interpretation will not suffice. But I'll try to illustrate just how complex and interconnected the global energy market is, how the role of sanctions imposed on Russia are hurting Europe, and what exactly can Europe do to get out of this situation, and lastly, is getting out of this grim situation even possible? So this deindustrialization of Europe looks imminent as the energy crisis has reached a tipping point. Energy is getting more and more expensive. So with natural gas prices over $100 per megawatt hour higher than they were a year ago, there seems to be some truth to these fears. Germany and Italy, two of the biggest economies from Europe, will soon be in a deep recession. Economic implications of Russia's war in Ukraine on the global economy and especially on Europe have been really mind-boggling, to say the least. Especially the impact on global supply chains has been particularly devastating. Barclays, for instance, has cut global growth forecasts and warns the world to brace up for the weakest growth in 4 decades, which is about 40 years. So, is this the beginning of an end? Well, part of the problem emerges from the unfinished project of recovery from the pandemic itself. I'm referring to the COVID pandemic. The other part is the impact of sanctions imposed on Russia that is creating a whole lot of problems for Europe, and cascading effects are being felt worldwide. In Europe, as the industrial running and output is severely impacted, various firms have been shutting down or cutting down production as the only means to survive. If they don't, they will not survive. Those that are most adversely hit are energy-intensive sectors like fertilizer producers, chemicals, steel, aluminium, to name a few. And not just these, but the production of, say, glass, paper, ceramics, cement, all are having to be curtailed due to skyrocketing energy prices and increasingly limited energy availability. Let me analyze some sectors for clarity. Let's start with the chemical industry. Now, Europe's chemical industry is a crucial element of almost all value chains and a vital part of its economy, which obviously explains why the general slowdown is actually happening. And the more worrying part is that not only in Europe, but globally, chemical production growth will slow down by almost a 2.7% in 2022, following a 7% increase last year. So to put things into perspective, up to 40% of Europe's chemical industry, like petrochemicals and basic inorganics, is at the risk of permanent cutbacks unless a sufficient amount of economic assistance package is introduced or natural gas prices fall. Now, obviously, the natural gas prices are not going to fall because the war is going to go for a long time. So the question then is, are respective governments in Europe doing something about it? So, well, in short, they are, but it's not enough. So, Germany's BASF, the world's largest chemicals company by revenue, was hit both by surging gas prices and the limited availability of other key products that I was just telling you about. Due to poultry business and difficult conditions in Europe, BASF's management recently launched a cost-cutting program to be implemented between next year, which is 2023, and 2024. The cuts are expected to reduce annual costs outside production by, say, 500 million euros. Business being cut in Europe is triggering another geo-economic shift as attention is turning back to, guess where? China. So, BASF expects further growth in China and plans to multiply investments there. So, the company's CEO was a part of the business delegation that recently accompanied Chancellor Olaf Scholz in his recent visit to China. Now, what about the fertilizer industry? See, since natural gas is required in large quantities to make fertilizers, many manufacturers in Europe have been forced to either reduce or even suspend production in its plants. So, the Brussels based Association Fertilizers of Europe has been calling for urgent government assistance as high natural gas prices have caused the suspension of a whopping 70% of ammonia production in Europe. And ammonia is a key ingredient for making fertilizers. Now, it is really interesting to note that while fertilizers by themselves are not really included in the scope of sanctions which are put on Russia, the supply has been interrupted due to sanctions imposed on Russia in other areas like banking, like transportation, insurance. So ultimately, it also indicates a worsening agricultural production and a looming food shortage in Europe. So the problems are not going to go anywhere. Data revealed by the Energy Market Intelligence shows negative effects of this rise in gas prices on fertilizer production across Europe. It's not just one country. Norwegian chemical company Yara, it's pretty famous, which is operating in Italy, France, Norway, Germany, and the German ammonia producer SKW have reduced production to survive. So not just the mainland Europe, but also in the UK, CF Fertilizers has already scaled down production and begun plans to actually cease production. And this story is the same for countries like Spain, Poland, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Lithuania, everywhere. Fertilizer companies are cutting down production if not forced to shut down already. Now, let's take a look at what is happening in the steel industry as the situation is as grim there. Steel demand recovery in developed economies suffered a major setback in 2022 as a result of persistent inflation. As you may be knowing that inflation is at an all-time high in most of the developed as well as developing economies, including India. In fact, India is doing far better than a lot of the developed world. And the other problem after inflation is the supply side bottlenecks which are persisting. So the war has made matters even worse. Demand in the EU is expected to contract by 3.5% in 2022. Looking at the European countries, Italy's strong reliance on Russia and Ukraine for certain iron and steel imports alongside natural gas has made it extremely vulnerable. And the story is still far from complete. Europe is losing half of its metal smeltering capacities as well. While metals like aluminium and zinc and those industries do not use natural gas directly, the vast amount of power that smelters consume has left them exposed to Europe's energy crisis. Now, let me just give you a perspective to make you understand how serious this is. Each ton of aluminium takes about 14 to 15 megawatt hours of power to produce, which is enough to run an average UK home for more than 3 years. Production of zinc also, which requires about 4 megawatt hours of power per ton, is also under severe strain because of the same reasons. Now, you may have heard about a company called ArcelorMittal. Now, ArcelorMittal announced it will switch off one of the 2 furnaces at its steelworks in Germany's Bremen until further notice from September end. And why? The reason is tenfold increase in gas and electricity prices. In yet another disturbing development, Norsk Hydro, which is again a very famous company, has already shut its aluminium smelter in Slovakia. Such closure adds to growing signs of stress in Europe's industrial economy. The decision is quite painful for Slovakia because the plant is one of the biggest employers in the region and the closure is going to result in job cuts. And Europeans are not really ready for it. And it's not just about the ground situation. Europe's energy crisis has also been contributing significantly to volatile trading on the London Metal Exchange. What is the key takeaway? the economic mayhem prevails. Let's now turn to how is Europe fighting for its survival. Germany, the powerhouse, is witnessing an unprecedented overhauling of its economy with energy diversification efforts, and I have talked about it at length in my other videos for ThePrint. It is now gaining control over a huge chunk of its industrial base in an effort to prevent shortages and blackouts this winter. In September 2022, Germany seized the local unit of Russian oil major Rosneft. So this move by Germany will also impact Rosneft holdings in France, Italy, Austria. And if you look carefully, it highlights how interconnected and therefore how vulnerable Europe's energy system is. Alongside the Rosneft decision unit and amid the controversial visit to China for bettering trade relations, Scholz's administration is in advanced talks to take over Uniper SC and two other major gas importers. The need for preserving critical infrastructure is urgent, with Uniper losing about 100 million euros a day as it tries to replace Russian gas to maintain deliveries to local utilities and manufacturers. If the government does not step in, these companies will go bankrupt. Does that mean that Europe will not be putting any more sanctions on Russia? And if they do, what is going to be the future trajectory of Europe's sanctions on Russia? What should be expected from the next tranche of sanctions, if at all it comes and whenever it comes? In my opinion, the new round, whenever it comes, won't be particularly hard-hitting. Because with soaring energy prices, it kind of seems inconceivable that any more measures will be taken regarding energy. Let me also remind you that 90% of Russian crude oil imports will be banned across the European Union on 5th of December. And this is a decision which was taken after a long deliberation throughout summer. However, the remaining 10% of the crude oil will continue being supplied via the Druzhba pipeline and is not really likely to be banned. Why? Because there are certain countries in Europe which are completely landlocked and they do not really have an option. So countries like Hungary, countries like Slovakia, for them, the ban does carry some sort of an exception. But what Europe really needs to look out for is another spike in oil prices when the ban takes effect. Now, this takes us to a related question. Will Europe's economic woes falter its support for Ukraine? Brussels had promised a macro financial assistance package of 9 billion euros to Ukraine in May 2022. Now, of that 9 billion, only 3 billion euros have actually reached Kyiv so far. There is, some disagreement on when the next two tranches of 3 billion euros each will be dispersed. The current economic challenges indicate that it could well be shifted to 2023 or even later. What does it tell us? Economic concerns are to take precedence before the European Union can form consensus on further assistance to Ukraine. Almost all trade analysts have one word to caution Europe against, and that word is complacency. For Europe, survival is going to be the order of the day. Whether these plans work or not is something I'll be watching closely in next few months. Until I'm back with yet another pressing global issue, take care and goodbye.